Do it.
Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Dynasty Done Differently. I'm Gabe, and I have Paul here with me. And today, what you guys have on your screen is you have the Keep Trade Cut rankings for the wide receivers on the left side, and then the Underdog ADP on 4 for 4. I can put the links down below. So then the Underdog ADP, if you guys don't know, there's Underdog Fantasy, which is kind of like a a redraft format, but then it is best ball. So it takes it's a best ball format. So you don't have to actually set your lineup. It just sets the best lineup every single week. But then it's not dynasty. You just draft that team for that year like a redraft league. So then what this is showing on 4 for 4 is it's showing the actual ADP, and then it's showing it for the last week. So from July 20th to today, July 27th, from when we are recording it. So these are the wide receivers on each side here. So what we're going to do today is try and compare both of these, and kind of see if there's some overvalued wide receivers and maybe some guys that are undervalued.
Yep. I like it. This is something we've been talking about for a long time, and we've heard other people doing this too, but not exactly in the way we're doing it. But I just think it's really helpful to look at these Keep Trade Cut Dynasty rankings right on the left, and then compare them to the Underdog ADP. And again, ADP stands for average draft position, so it's not quite the same thing. The Keep Trade Cut on the left are rankings. The Underdog ADP on the right is average draft position, where these guys are getting drafted. So we've talked about this in other videos, but as Dynasty becomes more and more of a yearly game, how guys perform this season has a greater influence on their Dynasty perception than it did maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So, just because someone's a rookie wide receiver, a couple years ago, a rookie wide receiver could come out and put up a stinker their rookie season and basically get a free pass. Now that still happens to an extent nowadays, but it's less likely and it's less common, and people are more likely to react more strongly to that, whether it's positive or negative. So we just wanted to highlight a couple guys today. Again, we are Dynasty Done Differently. We try not to focus so much on the specific players, more so the overall strategy, roster construction, and basically just the psychology of what we're doing. But it's helpful to point out a couple examples here. So let's start with maybe some of the guys who are values. Is that cool with you?
Yeah, sure. Oh, and then also I wanted to add, yeah, I guess, yeah. So I guess stress, yeah. So we're using this for dynasty purposes, not for underdog purposes. And then
Right.
also, I guess it's
Right.
important to add too the difference between these. So the left side are rankings, and keep trade cut. If you don't know, it's basically all user generated. So there's like three options, and you get to pick basically which players you like more than the other ones. And then the ADP if on underdog is so people are paying actual money to join these drafts, and then these are the guys they're actually drafting in the order they're drafting them in. So it's a big difference compared to keep trade cut, or somebody might say, they might input on here the keep trade cut like that they like Chris Olave, for example, but then in an actual draft they'll actually take Tyreek or something like that. So then he's higher, but then they actually take Tyreek. So that's what's cool about the underdog EDP is who these people are actually drafting, and they're paying money to do it.
Right. Exactly. Yep. You have to pay to play for underdog, and so that I think adds a little bit of more validity to these ADP rankings. Again, not positional rankings, ADP rankings, where these guys are actually getting drafted. Um, so without further ado, one guy that I wanted to highlight that I think is being undervalued right now by the Dynasty community is Stephon Diggs. And you'll kind of see a common theme here. I mean, it makes sense, right? Dynasty people tend to overvalue youth. So some of the guys who are undervalued are the older vets who are maybe crusty in the eyes of a lot of dynasty managers, but they're set to produce this season. You'll kind of see a little bit of a theme here. But so Stephon Diggs is one guy I wanted to talk about. On the Keep Trade Cut rankings, he's wide receiver 15 for Dynasty. Whereas then on the right side of our screen, on the underdog ADP, he's actually going as a wide receiver 5. Now that's pretty high. I mean, 10 spots may not sound like a huge difference, but that's 10 spots amongst wide receivers, not amongst all position players. So that's a pretty significant difference in my opinion, in our opinion. So to see that in Dynasty he's been ranked as the wide receiver 15, again, I understand he's not a spring chicken. He's getting up there in age. People want the shiny new toy, especially in Dynasty. But then to see that the underdog drafters, that again, these are not just rankings, these are ADP differences. The people who are paying money, playing Dynasty, playing underdog, probably playing Dynasty too, but playing underdog and actually have drafted Stephon Diggs is going as the wide receiver 5. Now, of course, the draft, the fantasy community can be wrong. We've been wrong many, many times before. We will be wrong many, many more times in the future. But I think that's too big of a difference to ignore. The fact that he's going as the wide receiver 5, people expect him to produce highly this year. He's tied to a good offense. He's tied to an elite quarterback. He's a target hog. Why is he wide receiver 15 in Dynasty in Keep Trade Cut? He's behind guys like Drake London, Jackson Smith, and Jigma. JSN is a great prospect. He hasn't done anything yet on an NFL field. Drake London had a great rookie season, great target share. Did it come anywhere close to the amount of points that Stephon Diggs was scoring last year? No. Again, you have to take everything into account, especially in Dynasty. You have to take the youth into account. But I think Stephon Diggs is being massively undervalued right now. And, uh, he's what, 20, he's 29.6 years old. He's not even 30 yet. Wide receivers, we've seen plenty of, especially the elite wide receivers, they don't fall off. Their production doesn't fall off as rapidly as guys who have not been elite in their careers. So Stephon Diggs could reasonably produce at this high a level or close to it for another 2 to 3 seasons. So why is he being ranked so far, or not so far, but why is he being ranked behind a guy like Drake London, behind a guy like JSN, even behind a guy like Garrett Wilson, who, by the way, according to KeepTradeCut, is the wide receiver 3 in Dynasty? I so anyway, that's kind of my argument there with Stephon Diggs. Do you feel like he's undervalued too, or do you see it differently?
I agree, yeah, and I think especially people should probably think about this too, about what offenses these people are on as well. So somebody like you said, Drake London, who's at 13 ahead of Diggs, he's on the Falcons, who should have a better offense this year, but they also threw the ball, I think what, last or second last year. So there's not going to be a lot of volume in that offense. So he's probably not going to get as big of an opportunity compared to a Diggs who's tied to Josh Allen and a top probably 5 or 6 offense this year. So I think that's something you also have to take into consideration as well.
Right. And I get it, like, right, people are playing Dynasty. Not everyone's necessarily contending right now. Some teams are rebuilding. So I could understand in principle why you'd want a Drake London or a JSN over Stephon Diggs on your team. Again, it makes more sense if you're a rebuilding roster. But if I'm a rebuilding roster and I have Stephon Diggs on my team, hopefully by now I've traded him for max value already. If I know I'm not competing this year, or we're kind of running into that time right now. August is when people start to realize, like, oh crap, I need players to set a starting lineup. So maybe if you are a rebuilding team with a Stephon Diggs, there's that 4 pack of older wide receivers who I think are still producing at a high level, still can produce at a high level, but have lost some of their shine for Dynasty. It's Diggs, it's Cooper Kupp, it's Devontae Adams, and it's Tyreek Hill. So if you have one of those guys and you're not planning on contending this year, can you trade one of them for max value, whether that's a younger wide receiver and a first, or 2 firsts, or a first in another position, or positional player, or can you use them to tier up and get an elite quarterback, something like that? Um, Meanwhile, I'm not opposed to this idea, and I've actually done it in a couple of my own leagues. But if you're a contending roster this year, can you take one of those guys who's more highly ranked on Keep Trade Cut, like a Garrett Wilson, like a Chris Olave, like a CeeDee Lamb, maybe one of those guys who's propped up a little bit because of their age compared to one of those 4 pack older guys, Hill, Kupp, Diggs, and Adams? Can you maybe, like, for example, a trade I made a couple weeks ago in one of my leagues was I traded CeeDee Lamb for Devontae Adams and a 24 first on a contending roster, with the idea being that Devontae Adams is going to help me just as much as CeeDee Lamb is to compete this year, perhaps even more, and then I'm tacking on a free first on top of it. Whereas the other person who made that trade probably saw it and was thinking, like, wow, Devontae Adams is 30 years old. CeeDee Lamb's, what is he, 23, 24? Like, that's a 6 or 7 year age gap that I'm gaining, and he's an elite producer. So again, different strategies, different directions, different trades make sense for different teams and different builds and different leagues. But I think it's important to be aware of some of these guys who are undervalued. And I don't want to ramble on too long here, but I'll keep it brief. But other guys that I noticed here, similar to Stephon Diggs, another one is Cooper Kupp. On Keep Trade Cut, he's there as the wide receiver 16, whereas on Underdog, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 3. And last year, he was going as the wide receiver 1, and the year before that, he was obviously like an elite season as the wide receiver 1 2 years ago. So similar to Diggs, this is a guy who has lost some of his shine for Dynasty because he's older, but he is still being projected to score at an elite level this year. And another one is Devontae Adams. Not as big of a difference for him, but he's the wide receiver 17 on Keep Trade Cut. And then on Underdog, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 10 on average. So again, that's a 7 spot difference. That's another guy who can outperform his ADP. Was there anything you wanted to add there before I move on to like some other guys? I don't want to keep talking for too long.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I think like the point I brought up before, I think it's also good to keep in mind what offense these guys are in. So I would say like Tyreek or Diggs kind of has a leg up from Cup or Devontae Adams. Especially Devontae Adams, I think the offense could be a little shaky this year, especially with Jacobs potentially holding out. And also, I think Cooper Cup is an interesting one because I think a lot of people are projecting the Rams to be pretty bad, but then they also won the Super Bowl 2 years ago. So I think that's kind of an iffy offense where a lot of people are projecting it to be pretty mediocre, but they could also get off to a hot start, and then he could be the wide receiver one, the first 10 weeks.
Sure. Yeah. Right. And that's another thing too. Even if you are a rebuilding roster, maybe you can trade these guys in season. Again, you're trying to get max value for them. I think you have a better chance of getting max value now as opposed to right. Let's say this, but the opposite of what you just said, Gabe. Like let's say the season starts and the Rams have a terrible offense and
Yep,
Cooper Cup is not performing well. Well,
exactly.
given his age, then you might not be able to get as much for him. So now would be the time to act. But again, especially for contending rosters, but just in general, looking at these rankings versus the underdog ADP, these are guys that are being undervalued. There are guys that are, their rankings do not reflect how much that the community is projecting them to be valuable to your team this year. And that has an effect whether you're a contending roster or a rebuilding roster or a team in the middle. Um, One other guy I wanted to talk about that's a little bit further down. He's a value. So here I'm going to start with the underdog ADP. So the underdog ADP, this is my boy, Amari Cooper, is being drafted as the wide receiver 17, right? Wide receiver 17, a mid wide receiver 2. On Keep Trade Cut, he is ranked as the wide receiver 37.
Wow.
37. That is a 20 spot difference. He's not even as old as some of those other guys like Cooper Cup and Devontae Adams. He's not even as old as them. Amari
29.
Cooper's 29, barely 29. And it's a 20 spot difference in redraft compared to in underdog redraft compared to dynasty keep trade cut rankings. Why? I don't
Wow.
understand why. I mean, I get it. Okay, it's because of the age. Amari Cooper is not the sexy new toy, the sexy new name. The offense was bad last year, but I am also of the belief that Deshaun Watson, whatever you think about him off the field, is going to have a rebound on the field this year and be much better or much closer to his pre-shenanigan form than he was at the end of last year. I truly believe that. If you don't think so, then okay, maybe you can justify not ranking Amari Cooper as highly. But to have him as the wide receiver 17, I mean, I'm sorry, to have him as the wide receiver 37 on Keep Trade Cut when he's going as the wide receiver 17 and underdog, it kind of blows my mind, honestly. So I mean, that guy. I feel like Amari Cooper would be easy to trade for. Like,
Yeah. I
can
like
you
that.
trade? Can you trade one of those guys who's propped up like a young guy? Like, let's use Drake London again as an example. You might be able to trade Drake London for Amari Cooper in a first.
And then look where London is behind Amari Cooper on underdog.
There you go.
22.
I didn't even notice that. Yeah, there you go. He's been drafted behind him. So again, a lot of people they play Dynasty, I think, in too long of a window, and I get it. Drake London, exciting prospect, solid rookie season. It- I think people are thinking that the offense has to get better at some point. They'll eventually figure out their quarterback position. What if they don't? What if they just don't? And it wastes the prime of his career. Or B, what if it just takes too long for it to really have an effect anyway? Why? I just again, people can play Dynasty the way they want to. The way I play it is though I don't go beyond a 3 year window at the most, and that's not. Don't even get me started on running backs. Running backs are like a monthly window, but that's a different story. But for wide receivers, like I just think sometimes people project too far ahead, and even if you're a rebuilder, kind of like we were saying in some of the examples earlier, let's say the season starts and Amari Cooper is smashing. A, if you're one of those middle teams, he might end up actually helping you turn into a contender if he outperforms what people are expecting him to do. Or B, if you're going the other route, then you can maybe trade him for a big difference, a big return to someone that is competing. So anyway, I know I'm getting on my soapbox here, but I think these guys are excellent examples of guys who are being undervalued right now by the dynasty community. Was there anything you wanted to add before I get to my last guy, who I think is undervalued?
No, all you.
Or not
Go
my
ahead.
last guy, our last guy, but so this one's a little bit further down. So on Underdog, this guy is being drafted as the wide receiver 48. So he's
Ooh.
going pretty late. This guy is not being drafted as a wide receiver 2. Wide receiver 48. You might have to go on to the next page.
There we go. Cortland
Or,
Sutton.
oh, there he is. Cortland Sutton, my boy Cortland Sutton. Now, the reason I bring him up, well, several reasons. So he's going as the wide receiver 48 on Underdog ADP. On Keep Trade Cut rankings, he is the wide receiver 61.
61.
Yes.
Wow, that's criminal.
Well, it's criminal, but it's not as big of a gap as it was for Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper was a 20 spot difference. This is only a 13 spot difference, which is still big. But and again, I understand why people have written Cortland Sutton off. He really had that one really kind of magical year and has been very lackluster ever since then. But a lot of people are predicting a rebound for I was going to say the New Orleans offense. I'm getting mixed up with Sean Payton. A lot of people are predicting a rebound for the Denver Broncos offense, right? Because they're bringing in Sean Payton. But it does not seem like the rankings here, the dynasty community, that's not being reflected with Cortland Sutton. Jerry Judy's still being drafted as a top 20 wide receiver. Both at Underdog, he's going high, but also he's ranked as a top 20 wide receiver on Keep Trade Cut. Cortland Sutton is ranked as the wide receiver 61. He's going behind guys like Brandon Cooks, who is significantly older, probably on a better offense, but significantly older. John Mechie, who I think it's remarkable that he's making a comeback, but he hasn't done anything on a football field. Josh Downs hasn't done anything on the football field. Alec Pierce, I was not inspired from his rookie season. I don't know about other people. And he's going just before guys like Rondale Moore, Wandale Robinson, Michael Thomas, the eternally injured Michael Thomas, and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Again, I understand the discontent with Cortland Sutton. I'm not saying he should be drafted or valued as a top 20 dynasty wide receiver, but I think a lot of people are projecting a rebound for the Denver offense, and that's being applied to Russell Wilson. That's being applied to Jerry Jeudy. In some cases, that's being applied to Marvin Mims. It's being applied to the running backs. It's definitely being applied to Greg Dulcich. But for whatever reason, it's not being applied to Cortland Sutton. Whereas, again, it's not a huge difference, but he is being drafted significantly higher if you look at Underdog's ADP. So anyway, I'm just saying, I think if we're going to buy the narrative of a rebound for the Denver offense, you kind of have to bump Cortland Sutton up in the rankings a little bit. So how do you feel, man? I mean, do you agree? Do you disagree? Were there any other guys you wanted to point out that you think are undervalued?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to sometimes bring up these older vets and then check out their ADPs and kind of how people are viewing them. Like you said, it's interesting. Yeah, I think sometimes it's just even if you don't really use Keep Trade Cut or you don't really believe that it's that's a great source. I think it can be good just to hop on here and just kind of see how people are viewing some of these guys. Like I had no idea Cortland Sutton was way down here.
Exactly.
So not to exactly. So and sometimes some of this probably isn't super useful in a startup as much, but then also in a just for trading as well. Like after you start up a league that's been around for a year or two, trying to do some of these tier downs or tier ups and things like that can be really helpful. And just to kind of be familiar kind of with how the community is viewing these guys, either in on Keep Trade Cut or on the Underdog ADP as well. It can kind of help you navigate things a little more, and then also be familiar just with kind of how the guys on your own team are viewed as well, because that can be helpful. Like, is this guy viewed low? Like maybe I shouldn't really go out and try and sell this guy. I should probably just hold him. Or oh my gosh, this guy is all of a sudden risen up and he's in like let's say somebody jumped out to me. I think Dotson. Like Dotson is the wide receiver 24. Let's see, where is he at? Because I think he was
He's
down
actually
pretty
one of the
far.
guys I was going to bring up that's overvalued. So it's funny you're bringing him up.
He was somebody who kind of jumped out to me earlier because then he's on Underdog. He's 37. So somebody like that, where maybe you drafted Dots when you got him, like because I think he's risen quite a bit recently over the off season. So that could be somebody that maybe you got in a startup, kind of at a lower ADP or something like that, and then now he's risen up. So now you want to maybe do a tier down off of Dotson to like who else to Amari Cooper, like you brought up, something like that. Can you can you give up Dotson and get Amari Cooper in a second? I think that's a smash deal. So I think that's what's helpful is sometimes you hop on and use these sources to your advantage, to not necessarily even trade targets, but also just looking at the players on your own team rather than, as I think a lot of people go on these sites and they look at like, oh wow, look at this guy like Tyreek Hill, Olave. I really want that guy on my team. But I think you also sometimes should look at it inversely and look at who are some guys on my own team and be kind of cognizant of where their value is, because it can change pretty rapidly.
Right. Exactly. And that's a perfect example that you brought up. Like maybe someone like Jahan Dotson you drafted kind of late, and now his ADP, even like in Dynasty startups, is going higher. So is that something that you can capitalize on, right? And move him tier down to a guy who's probably going to give you similar production and tack on a draft pick or another position player or something like that. So with that being said, I guess we can move into the overvalued guys, the guys who we kind of think are a little bit overvalued. Similar to the undervalued guys, you'll
Mm-hmm.
see a theme here. It's kind of the inverse. These are guys who, like a JSN, like a Drake London, are being propped up because they're young when they haven't really done much. And their underdog ADP does not reflect, as much confidence as maybe KeepTradeCut or the Dynasty community has for them. So, I one example is definitely JSN. He's a great example. On KeepTradeCut, he's the wide receiver 11. Again, I understand the hype. He's a great prospect. I love the teams that I have him on too. But he's being valued as the wide receiver 11 on KeepTradeCut. Underdog ADP, he's going as the wide receiver 32. That is a 21 spot difference, my friends. Again, I know Dynasty, we're playing a little bit more of a long game. It's not redraft, but with the extent to which it's become a yearly game. Now, JSN is interesting because I think he has enough of a pedigree and enough like name value, name cachet that even if he has a lackluster rookie season, he's a guy that people are going to make excuses for. Oh, it's because DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett were there. Oh, it's because Geno Smith took a step back. Oh, it's because the Seahawks like to run the ball. Like, I think he's a guy that people will make excuses for, but that doesn't change the fact that the underdog and the redraft and the best ball community and people who are paying money right now to draft, they're telling us a much different story than what the Keep Trade Cut rankings are telling us. So something to be in mind. Another couple fellow rookies that we noticed: Jordan Addison going as the wide receiver 18 on Keep Trade Cut, ranked as the wide receiver 18 on Keep Trade Cut. He's going as the wide receiver 36 on Underdog. That's all. I'm not going to sit here and I mean it's the same story basically as JSN, right? He hasn't done anything on the football field. He's being propped up because of his age, when in reality, might take a while to actually see that production that we want to see come to fruition, or it may never come to fruition. And then another rookie, one that I wanted to talk about. I think this one is he's similar to like the Cortland Sutton of the undervalued guys. He's a little bit further down the ranks here, but Jonathan Mingo, Keep Trade Cut has him as the wide receiver 44. Yep, there he is as wide receiver 44. Underdog ADP, you'd have to go to the next page because he's going as a wide receiver 63.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that is a 19 spot difference. And again, I think he's just being propped up because of his age, because he's the shiny new toy, maybe because there's a murky wide receiver room in Carolina. But what's to say that he's gonna outproduce someone like Cortland Sutton? And they're fairly similar. So, like for an example, for underdog ADP, Mingo's going as the wide receiver 63. Cortland Sutton is going higher. He's going as the wide receiver 48. But then in Dynasty, they're 2 spots apart. I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. Sorry, in Dynasty, Mingo's going way above Cortland Sutton. But
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying is they're probably going to score fairly similar, at least in a fairly similar range. So, like, can you take someone like Jonathan Mingo and trade him for Cortland Sutton in a second? Even if you're a rebuilding roster, how does that hurt your team? I
Mm-hmm.
understand you're adding a few years at the wide receiver position, but Cortland Sutton is not a guy who's 35 years old. He's, what do we say, 26, 27? He's 27.
27.8.
Yeah.
Is not cool.
He'll turn 28 during the season. So, yes, I know you're adding age to your team, but if he's going to produce similarly, or at least I'm projecting, I think we are projecting, he'll produce similarly to Jonathan Mingo this season, plus you're tacking on an extra second, how is that bad for your team, even if you're a rebuilder? You have an extra second, you have a draft pick, which is usually what rebuilding teams are looking for, and you have another guy who you can potentially trade. If Cortland Sutton doesn't fit your build, you can trade him. I don't think it's much of a difference going from someone like Jonathan Mingo to Cortland Sutton. Do you see it differently?
No, I agree. Yeah, I think, yeah, kind of going off of that, like a Jaden Reed, who I think is kind of viewed similarly to Mingo. He's over here at wide receiver 76. So I think,
Right.
yeah, I really like the idea of tearing off these guys. I think it might be a little harder now. I think some people are probably realizing that these guys, probably aren't really going to do that much for me this year. People are drafting them pretty high, like the early second round, even for Mingo or Reed. But I think it might be a little harder as the hype has kind of died down. As now we're pretty far removed from the rookie drafts, about 3 months now. But also some guys still might be there, and maybe send it over to like to a rebuilding roster if you're trying to compete. You give them, oh, like I drafted, yeah, like this guy at the 210. I got Jaden Reed. Then I'll send it to this rebuilder guy who might like him because he's probably not going to score a lot of points, but he could be good in the future. Then I'll take his Cortland Sutton in a third or a second or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And even if you're like let's say maybe you're one of the teams in the middle, you're not a super strong contender, but you're not necessarily tanking either. You could still make a move like that. Like you said, trade Jonathan Mingo to a team that's rebuilding. Maybe someone who, your league, you know your league mates. Maybe it's someone who overvalues youth. Maybe it's someone who is rebuilding, so they convince themselves they need all the young pieces. All right, go offer that person Jonathan Mingo for a Cortland Sutton-esque wide receiver plus something else on top of it, whether it's a draft pick or another position player or whatnot. So I just think, thinking about it this way, looking at these different sites and these different um, I guess, ways of looking at these players can help us think differently about it, can help us make moves that benefit our teams, regardless of what exactly our team build is or what the economy of our league is like. And I won't go too much into detail, but some of the other guys we picked out, you already mentioned it, Jahan Dotson, wide receiver 24 for Keep Trade Cut, but he's going as the wide receiver 37 on Underdog. So he's another guy that's being propped up probably because of his age. And then we already touched on Drake London earlier, but he's the wide receiver 13 on Keep Trade Cut. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 22 on Underdog. So that's a 9 spot difference. So, you can use whatever sources you like to use. I know Keep Trade Cut is a pretty popular one. Underdog is popular in terms of ADP, but you can look at different sports books projections and how they're projecting these players to do for the season. You can even make your own rankings, right? Look at your own rankings and see how that compares to some of these other rankings or these ADP. But I think it's just important to think about this stuff and try to think about things in a different way and not just, oh, well, this guy's ranked higher than this guy or this guy's younger than this guy, so I prefer him because it's Dynasty or something like that. You know?
Yeah, because I think that's a good point. Because ultimately, yeah, you want to play the market and the value game a little bit. Because I think, yeah, like when I started out playing Dynasty, I would hop on Keep Trade Cut, and all right, Treylon Burks is wide receiver 31. I want to try and get a better receiver, so I'm going to do Burks in a second, and I'll jump up here a little bit, and I'll get Jerry Jeudy or something like that. That's probably not a great example, but I think sometimes I think you kind of want to assume that you're playing with smart managers in your leagues, but also sometimes don't assume that they are thinking the same way as you. I think it's one of the big things I've learned through playing in my leagues. Is that don't assume that, oh yeah, that's how that guy's going to view it. No, I'm not even going to send that trade to this guy. He's going to reject that. I would just send it out. Sometimes Keep Trade Cut and things like that, the guy who you send the trade to is going to view it completely differently, which I think is pretty important to keep in mind during this. And then use these sites to your advantage and try and think of some different pivots that you can do or some guys that you personally like. And then, like I said, look at some of the player values on your own team and also players on other teams as well.
Right. Right. Yeah, and like Gabe said earlier, like we can post the links to these different websites in the description of the video. But even go through and look through the Keep Trade Cut rankings for yourself. Pick out guys that you think are overvalued or undervalued, and use that to inform some of the decisions that you're making with your team, regardless of whether you're in the middle or contending or rebuilding or something else. you know. So I think that's kind of the ultimate point of this video. And the wide receivers are the easiest example of it, I think, because the wide receivers are the deepest position, and they're also very highly valued. One last thing I will say just really quick, because it kind of relates to this topic, but we touched on it briefly earlier. So Keep Trade Cut rankings have Garrett Wilson as the wide receiver 3 in Dynasty. Which, first of all, I hadn't checked Keep Trade Cut in a while, so I didn't even know he had gotten this high. But
That's
I
crazy.
mean, he's above literally everyone except Jefferson and Chase. And again, I understand the hype, but think about it. How much higher can Garrett Wilson go in terms of value? First of all, his rookie season does not track like JJ's or Jamar Chase's. Like he wasn't at the historic level of production that those guys were at their rookie seasons or their first 2 years. Obviously, he's going into a second year. And I understand the quarterback upgrade, but how much higher can his value go? Unless you truly believe he's going to be in the Jefferson or Chase range, which is fine. Maybe you think that. Personally, I don't. As I said, he doesn't track that way through his rookie season. But that's fine. It's not something I'm going to argue with people on if they think something else. But is Garrett Wilson someone who's at his prime peak value right now? Like, can you get more for Garrett Wilson right now than you maybe ever can again in Dynasty? I don't know. I think so. He might be someone worth tearing off of too. And again, similarly like Chris Olave, Chris Olave technically on a point per game basis was better than Garrett Wilson last year, but those are two guys who I'm not saying they're not studs. I'm not saying they can't be difference makers for your team, but the question is where the community is ranking them, how much higher can they realistically go from here? Even Chris Olave is the wide receiver 8, right? there's not much room for upward trajectory, especially the case with Garrett Wilson. So can you trade these guys? Can you tier down to maybe one of those older guys that someone thinks is crusty, and tack on another first or even a second or 2 seconds or something like that? So just, think about these things and be willing to make the moves that feel uncomfortable in the moment, and be willing also to move the players that other people want. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yep.
you're probably going to have a much harder time trading away someone like Portland Sutton, even though we were propping him up as someone that's maybe undervalued. You're going to have a much harder time trading someone like him away compared to Garrett Wilson. And, just to think about the things you could get in return for someone like Garrett Wilson, you might not ever be able to beat that type of value again. So, anyway, for me, I'll kind of leave it there. But did you want to say anything else to close this out, or are we good?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. I think that last point is important too. Where, yeah, I wouldn't be afraid to sell some of these guys. Like you said, if you think they're at their peak value, I wouldn't be afraid to sell these guys. I know it's cool to have the flashy Garrett Wilson on your team, but also it can be cool to trade that for Justin Herbert or something like that. Some smash quarterback or something like that, or you can get like another good wide receiver like we were talking about, and then also some picks as well, so that you can draft some guys later, or in a different trade and tier up at quarterback or something like that, or buy like a RB during the season. So I think it's
Right.
important to kind of keep that in mind, because I remember like it was Garrett Wilson last year. It was before he was now here he's number 3 on KeepTradeCut. I think it was when he was probably like top 15 or top 12 or something like that. I traded him for Justin Herbert in a league. So sometimes you like some of these guys in your leagues are just gonna be, oh my gosh, I need that player. And sometimes if you just put them in their inbox, they're probably gonna snatch them up, and they might kind of overpay for it a little bit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because of the hype of the name and the age.
Hmm.
And you got to look deeper than that. And I like that you brought that up too, right? Some of these uber elite wide receivers,
Hmm.
I think Chase and Jefferson are in a tier of their own, but some of these other guys, you might be able to use them to tier up to get a better quarterback, something like that, right? Like, can you attach a Garrett Wilson to a Derek Carr and go get a Justin Herbert or a
Hmm.
Josh Allen or a Joe Burrow or a Trevor Lawrence or whoever is, someone that you consider an elite quarterback? Again, we play that way. The warp and just the valuation in Dynasty says that the quarterbacks are above everything else. So can you use one of these, really hyped up wide receivers, young wide receivers, to get a quarterback or something else that your team needs? So I think we'll leave it there for now. I think that was a good discussion. Let us know in the comments. What do you guys think? I mean, are you comfortable making those uncomfortable moves? What sorts of moves would you consider making? And maybe what are some of the guys that you think are undervalued or overvalued, or do you just see this stuff differently than we do? We're obviously open to feedback and comments, and we'd love to, have a discussion too with people about these things. But I think this video kind of reflects the way that we play Dynasty, and again, what our name suggests, we're trying to play Dynasty differently than most other people. We're trying to look deeper, but it's not just looking deeper. It's just, using all these resources that everyone has access to, but using them and thinking about them in different ways than other people, and applying that to the market and the psychology of our leagues. So, and as a future clinical psychologist, it's right up my alley. So, and as an accountant, right, I'm sure the marketing and the
Yeah,
valuations, economics of Dynasty
exactly.
appeals to me. So
All the
I think we have
econ
a good
stuff.
kind
Yeah.
of overlap there.
Mhm.
So, all right, well, close us out, man. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I guess I would add one more point along the talking about Garrett Wilson again. But for an example, somebody like Garrett Wilson, if you were in a startup draft last year, he was going in the 6th, 7th round. So somebody like that, if you drafted him and he's still on your team, and then you hop on and keep trade cut and you see he's the wide receiver 3, I wouldn't be too afraid to sell somebody like that, because you drafted him, let's say, the 5th, 6th, 7th round, something like that. Or you can insert name here as well. But then all of a sudden, if you see at the ADP they're being drafted in the 2nd round of a startup, I wouldn't be, because sometimes, I mean, if you want to play like that, you can keep them for sure. But if you can extract a bunch of value when you drafted them so much lower, it can be a huge deal for your team to all of a sudden get like another great wide receiver and like 2 picks or something like that. It can be massive for your team.
Right. Well, because think about, at that point, you've already won. You've already won. You
Exactly.
you hit on the pick. You hit on the pick when you drafted him wherever you drafted him, and now he's valued where he is now. And as long as you can get the appropriate trade value back for him, you've already won. You've already hit on the pick. So, yeah, good point. Good point to close us out there. But This is a fun video. We might do a similar thing with running backs in the future, or maybe kind of looking at some of the different positions, undervalued, overvalued guys. As we are getting into redraft season, right, that becomes a little bit more at the forefront of our minds, but we can also use that information to make us smarter and better dynasty players as well. So, with that, thank you all for tuning in. Please like the video, subscribe, leave a comment if there's anything you'd like to let us know, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, guys. See you.